Hey, sorry for the long silence because I'm trying to check it again and again whether my voice is getting recorded or not. Finally, my voice is getting recorded, and I will not be able to do any editing in this because I'm not having my laptop currently with me. So let's start it. Hi everyone, myself Shubham Sharma, and welcome back to the channel HER with Sharma. The series is dedicated towards epidemiology for health economics and outcome research, and the current session we will be discussing about analytical study design. The agenda for this session is actually to have overview about analytical study design, discussing case control cohort study with a few examples and about their limitations and advantages, and finally concluding it with key takeaways. So in the previous presentation, we discussed that a study design can be divided either as an observational or an experimental study design. And by now, I'm sure that you are aware that analytical study design is actually a part of observational study design. The analytical study design can be further divided as case control and cohort studies. The case control study is also known as retrospective study design because in this, the researcher is taking the individuals back in time to check about their exposure or certain practices. Like, for example, the researcher took 50 patients, which is cases, and then take 50 individuals, matching it with the cases known as control, then taking this individual of 100 back in time to know about their smoking or maybe any exposure. So they are actually determining the association between the exposure and outcome. Whereas in cohort kind of study, initially the individuals recruited in the cohort are disease free. Now the researcher will either take them ahead in time or back in time to check whether the exposure leads to a specific outcome or not. Or it could be either the combination of prospective or retrospective, which becomes a combination cohort study design. So let us focus on the advantages and limitations of case control studies. As earlier I told that a case control study is good enough to determine the association between exposure and outcome. Similarly, it is economical because the researcher is not investing that much of time, or quickly the results can be harnessed from those 100 individuals or those case controls. Hence, it becomes economical. And case control studies are also very helpful for rare outcomes or rare diseases. Similarly, for a single outcome, a lot of exposures can be determined through this case control study. Well, it is not suitable for determining the incidence for any of the cases. Similarly, it is not suitable for determining the causation. It could be good enough to determine the association, but for determining the causation of exposure and outcome, one needs to do or needs to follow. Uh, there was one of the method that is Hill's criteria of causation. So that has to be followed. Then only one can say that the exposure is actually leading to the outcome. Similarly, it is the case control studies are susceptible to bias. Actually, all the analytical studies are susceptible to bias and confounders. So these sections will be separately discussed in another discussion within this epidemiology for HUR domain or HUR series, where we will be discussing in depth about how to tackle with these biases and confounders. Now, let us take a hypothetical example of this case control study for the lung cancer. Now, the researcher recruited 50 individuals with lung cancer and then matched this with 50 controls. And now the researcher comes to know that okay, the odds ratio for the lung cancer due to smoking was 3.5, and this were the table which he prepared. Now, let us go to another presentation and try to find out how this 3.5 actually comes in. So let us take this. Okay, it's working. Case control. As I told that the researcher is aware about the outcome, that is lung cancer with and without, took these individuals back in time to know their smoking history, Yes, and no. So let us cross check. It's 35, 15, 35, 15, and I guess it was 20 and 30. Yeah. So the number of smokers were 55, the number of non-smokers were 45, number of lung cancer patients were 50 and 50. Now the researcher will be determining the odds ratio. What's odds ratio? It's odds of having an event in the exposed group compared to having an event in the unexposed group. That's definition, but let's try to calculate it. That is 35 divided by 20 divided by 15 divided by 30. So transposing it, it becomes, so this got deducted, 3 fives, so 35 divided by 10, it comes up to be 3.5 odds ratio. So it could be defined as the odds of having lung cancer is 3 point times higher in smokers compared to that of non-smokers. So this is how the interpretation comes in, and this is how the actual calculation comes in for determining the odds ratio. So this was a hypothetical example which we went through. Now let us take a real life example. This study was actually conducted by Akshari et al. In Iran, in which the researcher tried to determine various factors for osteoporosis in 270 women aged 35 to 65 years of age. Now, the researcher come to know that second-hand, there were a lot of outcomes, but I've written few of them. Like second-hand smoking actually increases the odds of osteoporosis by 3.38 times. Similarly, rheumatoid arthritis is also increasing the odds of osteoporosis by 6.58 times. Whereas increased weight and calcium supplementation is actually reducing the odds by 1.4% and 8.6% respectively. So through this, we can understand that the smoking and rheumatoid arthritis is not good for means if the persons have this factors, then they are more prone towards having osteoporosis, whereas if they are having regular or calcium supplementation, and if their weight is higher, then they are having a protective kind of means they are protective towards osteoporosis. This is what the interpretation goes on, because if odds ratio is less than 1, the exposure is protective in nature, whereas if the odds ratio is more than 1, then the exposure is not protective in nature. So this is how the interpretation goes on. Now let us discuss about cohort study design. So earlier, as I told in that slide, that in cohort study design, initially the entire sample of the population is disease free. Then the researcher takes that individual ahead in time to determine the impact of exposure to the outcome. Well, there are three types of cohort studies, that is prospective, retrospective, and combination of two. Then it is very useful in determining temporality of exposure and outcome. Now, what does temporality mean in simple words? Temporality actually means that the exposure should come before the outcome. If there is an outcome, then it should be followed by exposure, which means if you are consuming ice cream, then only you should fall ill or you should have a sore throat. If you are not consuming an ice cream, you should not have a sore throat. So this is what temporality actually means. So let us discuss about the advantages and limitations of cohort study. As I told that the cohort study is good to determine the temporality of exposure and outcome. It is good to determine the incidence cases also, because in a cohort study, if you are going ahead in time, you can actually determine the new cases. And similarly, for a single exposure, you can determine multiple outcomes. Well, as itself I told earlier that if you are going ahead in time, then you need to invest a lot of resources to track those individuals. Hence, it is very time consuming and expensive too. And it is less suitable for rare diseases because as rare diseases are rare, like 1 in 10,000 individuals or 1 in 1 lakh individuals, so you need to follow a sufficient amount of people for a brief period of time, which is very difficult in case of rare diseases. Hence, for rare diseases, usually case control studies are been taken into consideration and not cohort studies. Now let us take a hypothetical example of silicosis in factory worker. Now the researcher tried to determine whether the factory workers working in silica factory are more prone towards silicosis or not. So what he did, he recruited 100 individuals working in that factory who were not having silicosis at that time, and then followed for a period of time and come to know that the risk ratio of sorry silicosis and exposed individuals were 3.8. Now, how this 3.8 comes into play, let us discuss going back in that presentation slide. Let me erase the entire thing. So right now we are discussing about cohort study. In this, currently the individuals are disease free. Then they will be followed ahead in time. Now, few will have the disease and few will not have the disease. So this is how the cohort studies, prospective cohort studies, has been conducted. Now let us take that example in which the exposure was present and absent in few cases, and silicosis occurred in few and not in few cases. What was the number? 38, 12, and 10 and 4. So in the cohort study, the researcher determines a relative risk. Now, relative risk is actually the probability of having an event in the exposed group compared to that in the unexposed group, which is 38 divided by 38 plus 12 divided by 10 divided by 10 plus 40, which comes up to be 38 divided by 50 divided by 10 divided by 50, which comes up to be 38 divided by 10, which is 3.8. So the relative risk of having silicosis is 3.8 times higher in the exposed group compared to that of unexposed group. This is how the interpretation takes place, and this is how the calculation for this relative risk is actually been conducted. Let us go back to our presentation. Now let us take a few advantages of conducting a cohort study. So this is a very famous Framingham heart study, which was used to determine various cardiovascular diseases. So through cohort study, you can actually determine outcomes in generations. Like if you are following that cohort for quite a period of time, you can determine the outcomes for first generation, second generation, and third generation also. Similarly, this help in creating a data which might be useful in conducting certain other studies. Along with that, it is very useful for extensive research output. For this Framingham Heart study, there was nearly 3,000 plus publication uh, sh- using this Framingham Heart databases. So you would be able to understand how important such cohort studies are. But due to their difficulties in conducting and follow up and expenditure, usually cohort studies are not been taken into consideration. But if conducted properly, lot of outcomes can be determined. So now concluding it with a key takeaways, that is the case control studies are quick, cost effective, follows outcome to exposure, and are retrospective in nature. Cohort studies are useful in determining temporality, can be useful in determining incidence, always goes from exposure to outcome, can be either retrospective, prospective, or a combination of these two? Well, both the studies are having their unique advantages and disadvantages and are helpful in determining the research hypothesis. So this is the short description of a case control and cohort kind of analytical studies. In the next presentation, I will be discussing about experimental study design, that is randomized control trial. Till that time, take good care of yourself and bye.